Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Zoomversation. I'm trying to get that word to catch on. I hope you can help me. Called a plague of our own. It's 2 days before the first Seder, and I'm joined by a remarkable group of thinkers and writers who were part of a larger remarkable group of people we had write essays about the plagues that we published last week. And we're here to talk about how we're thinking about the 10 plagues in the context of this current plague or not plague. We'll be discussing that. I forgot to even say, I'm Jodi Rudoren. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Forward, and The Forward has been trying to bring community around the issues that we're all thinking about and talking about during this pandemic through a series of Zoom conversations. So we're thrilled that you signed up and are joining us. And as I said, we do have quite a group here today. I'll probably introduce them a little bit more as we go, but Deborah Lipstadt and Tema Smith are two of our contributing opinion columnists. Deborah is, of course, one of the premier scholars of the Holocaust, DeRote Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory. Tema is a Jewish professional and educator. She's based in Toronto, which is where she's calling in from today. We also have with us Virginia Heffernan, an opinion columnist at the LA Times and co-host of Slate's Trumpcast podcast. We have Jong Fast, an editor-at-large at the Daily Beast and the author of 2 novels and a memoir. We have Benjamin Wittes, a journalist who focuses on law and security issues and is a fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we have with us Noah Lubin. Lubin? He'll tell us. Who's an artist as well as a writer in New York, and he actually was the illustrator for this project. And as we get going, right before we start, I'm going to attempt to share my screen and play for you a quick little GIF of his wonderful art for this project. So bear with my Zoom skills. Here we go, I think. Uh-oh, yeah, there we go. יש בי אהבה מדי, ימים כלילות רק רוצה להיות, והמתנה מתנה מותנית באהבה, נשמה חשוכה, תן לי אותך ולא רק אם, תן אהבה בלי תנים בלי תנאים. Thank you, Noah, for that awesome art. I wonder if you'll kick us off by telling us a little bit about how you approached doing the art for the project, and having been sort of immersed in all of the essays and in so many different perspectives on the plague, as well as sharing your own essay, maybe how what you kind of took from that and what that array of different perspectives, how that came out in your art.
Sure. First, just to give a big thank you, for the authors and the journalists who create inspiring posts. I read them one by one, and I basically would stop at moments of inspiration. I would have a moment of prophecy. I would have an image pop in my mind or something inspired from the post, and would basically go and start trying to sketch. I obviously would go back and finish their article to make sure that the post had coherence with the content. And I actually had my kids all at home, and I would show them the sketches I made to see how they would read them. Say, what do you think about this? And as long as they could read them and my wife could read them, I assumed they had some coherency, and I would bounce them back and forth with the forward and make some modifications to them. And then overall,
you wrote your own essay as part of the collection. It was about neighbors and some of the smelly neighbors you grew up with and how you're feeling about your neighbors today. And I wonder, I don't know if you were saying that neighbors are a plague or an antidote to a plague or what, but tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I just hope none of them are listening. No, I grew up in a lot of different apartments in Chicago, moved around a bit. Even now we have a condo, and I have a condo owner next door who we're very friendly with, but she's bothered with my children, the noise from an older single woman who's bothered by the noise of my children during Corona. They're all at home stomping all day long. And anyway, yeah, I just thought, it'd be a funny sort of association to make, and realizing some of the challenges I was having currently with the neighbor, and it set me in some reflection on just neighbor relations over the years, and realizing that the corona situation has us all just locked down, stuck next to each other, waving over a fence perhaps with a face mask, but neighbors nonetheless, and having to sort of reflect and think, well, how can I share these complex spaces and moments with my neighbors during the corona outbreak.
Ben, you wrote an essay that was sort of about the upsides of the current situation and some of the plagues in the Haggadah. You talked about how cattle disease might not be so bad in the era of climate change. Maybe we would reduce emissions and things like that. And I was thinking a lot about how there's been a lot of talk on social media among my friends in general about kind of the silver linings of this experience, whether it's about, we're spending more time together as a family, cooking at home, not having to commute, etc. I wonder, is it okay to think about the upside or the silver linings of plagues, or is that sort of verboten, do you think?
Well, so I'm a little bit nervous about being the pro-plague faction of this conversation, but since that is the role you've assigned me, I will gamely take it on. Look, I think there is a natural human tendency in horrible situations to notice, sometimes ironically and sometimes gratefully, the unintended bright sides of the situation. And for a lot of people on my social media, that seems to involve food, because people do a lot of stress baking, or people have time to do certain types of like cooking for themselves that they're not otherwise doing. And so when you guys asked me to write this little essay, I found myself receiving that email while lying in a hammock next to a fire pit in my backyard, drinking scotch and listening to music. And I got this essay, could you write a reflection on the 10 plagues? And I said, well, this plague ain't so bad right now for me. And I felt a little guilty about saying it, but then I thought, okay, we don't record in the Torah the bright side of the 10 plagues, but somebody must have been lying in a hammock thinking this isn't so bad. And so I started looking up the 10 plagues and one by one and thinking, like, what could be the bright side? And well, it turns out like we have a major blood shortage in the United States right now. I don't know that the Potomac River turning into O-negative blood would be gross, but I don't know that it would be the worst thing in the world. And frogs, right? Bring forth frogs in abundance. Well, the world is running out of amphibians right now. They're all going extinct. I don't know that I want them hopping in my shower or in my kneading trough, but I'm not sure that like the problem right now is not too many frogs, it's too few. And so, plagues can counteract that kind of reality. So look, some plagues are easier to come up with the bright side of than others. Some of them I honestly had a little trouble with. I said in the piece that I couldn't figure out the bright side of lice. I was
also the slaying of the firstborn. I think you took a pass on.
No. I came up with the bright side of the killing of the firstborn. I think the whole project wouldn't have worked if you couldn't come up with a bright side of slaying of the firstborn, because that's the punchline of the whole 10 plagues, And so if you can't come up with one for that, the project really doesn't work. Lice, I had a lot of trouble with. Locusts, I had a lot of trouble with. But immediately when the piece was published, a school nurse through a mutual friend got in touch and said, if you're a kid, the bright side of lice is you get sent home from school and you're fine. Like, it's not the biggest problem in the world. So I missed the boat on lice. There actually was a bright side there. Look, should I feel guilty about it because I'm a bad person and I'm sitting here looking at the bright side of things? Yeah, sure.
Molly, I'm going to put you in the pro-plague camp too, because you wrote about how growing up that part of the Seder was one of your favorites. And I think that's actually pretty common. There's something very visceral and fun about the dipping of the finger into the wine. And I think also it's sort of the beginning of the ramp down to dinner is my sense in the sort of arc. So, and I guess I'd love you to talk a little bit about why you think, I mean, is there anything bigger than that about why people love that part of the Seder? Is there a little bit of us, you know, this dipping is supposed to be because we're not so mean to our enemies, right? We take a bit out of the wine, but maybe it's a really vengeance. Maybe we're just really happy that our enemies got plagued.
I always think of it as the fun part of the Passover Seder. You know, it's like we're all chanting and singing and sticking our finger in the wine, and it's kind of my favorite part of it. And also, you know, you're almost done. But in subsequent years, I've seen all sorts of bad behavior from my family members trying to stop drinking and sticking their finger in the wine. And I actually had a family member who was sober, who was sticking their finger in the wine and then eventually just started, sucking the wine and then just started drinking. So it's problematic. I tend to use grape juice. But yeah, the plagues, I mean, I think it was theoretically fun until we realized they could happen to us, you know, and now that we have this pandemic and then we also have locusts and there are rivers, there are red blood rivers and different, you know, there's these different, we're having sort of weird variations on the actual plagues. And I never thought I would see that in my lifetime.
Virginia, I'm going to let you kick off the anti-plague camp then, as long as we're going to turn this into a debate. And you wrote really powerfully about the way the pandemic and the idea of a plague challenges people's spirituality, beliefs. How does this make us think about God and other things? So tell us some of your thinking there.
Well, I like that Benjamin had to look hard for the upsides of plagues because the whole story is about plagues. All 10 plagues are meant to be signs and symbols of God's presence. But since Ben and I have talked about the G word, which is off the table mostly for Ben, the idea that they symbolize God's great justice and protections is not enough to make sense of frogs. For some of us in a more secular idiom. I started, because so many of us have spent the last 4 years, being worried about the Pharaoh, being worried about Trump. That I wanted to take the opportunity to revisit the kind of junior high school idea that we're in another kind of conflict now, not man versus society, or man versus man, but rather man versus nature. And to just re-interrogate what I think nature is. To that, I went a little bit reflexively to Yuval Harari, just because there's a fantastic description in Homo sapiens about wheat having civilized man, sort of man civilizing wheat. So in this case, what are the microbes doing to and for us? We're in a pitched battle with an invisible enemy. I keep reminding myself, one of the first things I learned about the coronavirus particle is that if you take a strand of human hair, imagine it at the width, not the length of a football field, the coronavirus particle takes up 4 inches on it. And this brings to mind discussions of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Wow. We're in a kind of microscopic world that is essentially unimaginable. It confounds the brain. 4 of the plagues, if you count animal pestilence, are bugs. So locusts, flies, lice, and then the pestilence. The way that you know that the animal pestilence or the animal strange behavior, animal striking mysterious poses, as what is that, the Prince lyric, the way you know that the bugs are active is by what we do, right? So if you think of us as ourselves little organisms, members of a species, not for the first time in my memory, I'm identifying entirely as a member of the species, as an organism. It doesn't matter. You know, these tribal affiliations for now are tabled. And we can, and always in plague years, people go to worrying about the elites locking themselves away, like Prince Prospero in The Mask of the Red Death, the Poe novel. In Boccaccio, the elites take care of themselves in different ways. But interestingly, those ways often backfire. They lock themselves together. They go to CPAC. They shake hands with CEOs and think, these people can't contaminate me. CEOs can't be contaminating. So in any case, as I started to kind of ruminate on the sort of insult to the brain posed by how uncanny these little bugs at war with our lungs are, I started to think about ways we figure God's power, and it moves wrong. It operates wrong. It's insensate at the smallest level and more intelligent than any human could be, more intelligent than human civilization could be. That's Harari's point about wheat. It got us to stop moving. It got us to accept this one weed as the source of our nutrition. And so I started to imagine that maybe God is in the microbes. And if you'll just go with me here for a second, you know, we all know and have studied that now that the human microbiome, that our guts are the most biodiverse place on the planet Earth. They make the jungles and look completely, sorry, it's my COVID. They make those things look completely homogenous. And, you know, there's much talk about, does the brain exist to serve the microbiome, right? Are the microbes in charge of us? And we only think we're in charge with our brains. That maybe this God that gives and takes away, that you know, that punishes that punishes the Egyptians but favors the Jews, or that punishes the Republicans but favors the Democrats. Maybe we think Biden will win out of this. And the last thing I'll say on that point, and that's a very strange God, but the thing to think about the coronavirus is it of course wants to survive like all organisms, but it's not evil nor good. It's just novel. That's the only thing this virus is. The only reason we're moving this way is because it's not priced in. We haven't seen this thing before. Our lungs and RNA doesn't know what to make of it. Overreact, underreact. And, you know, assimilating the novel would seem to be a part of, or disassimilating, or getting rid of this thing. But when we get our immunities to coronavirus, you know, knock on wood, we'll have neutralized it, but we'll have taken it into our systems. We'll recognize it. We'll have this sort of neutralized combination of us and it. And in that way, there's something moving about this challenge. It's like new immigrants came in. You need to speak their language. We can't overreact or underreact. We need to be able to move in harmony with them. And I find that kind of moving. And I find there seems to be a message about faith in that. A better theologian than I am could tease it out.
I thank you, Virginia. I think there's a really rich line here that I want a number of you to jump in on about, you know, the science and theology, God, and people, and plagues and pandemics and the distinctions. I'm going to actually turn to Deborah to pick up on this in just a second, particularly with her sort of Holocaust historian hat on, not so much necessarily about the essay that you wrote yet. We'll get back to that. But I want to first share something that an attendee sent in advance, something that Rabbi Adam Raskin of Congregation Har Shalom in Maryland said. He said, "It's critically important to distinguish between scientific and biblical language. Pandemic is a diagnostic term for a disease that affects a large number of people worldwide. A plague, in the religious sense, is an exceptional phenomenon wielded by God for a variety of instructed purposes, to punish, to teach, to display God's power over other deities, etc. Whether we read biblical plagues as historical accounts or as sacred metaphors, a plague by definition is limited to the time and place of the Bible. We must be very careful not to ascribe theological causation to modern sickness, storms, natural disasters, or other inexplicable misfortunes." That's obviously one rabbi's view, but I think we are, in a way that is reminiscent, I think, of some of the things we read about some of the wrestling that people did in the camps. We are wrestling with this line between what is people's doing versus some kind of thing that we can't, something beyond our understanding. And I don't know, Deborah, jump in. It's not really a question.
Well, I'm reminded of a wonderful memoir by Ruth Gruber, Still Alive. I don't know how many of you have read it. It's probably, to my mind, with Primo Levi, the second best memoir. I mean, the two of them share in terms of recollections of pre-Holocaust time in the camps and afterwards. It's full of piss and vinegar, and she describes a moment of, she taught a comp lit at Irvine and at Princeton for many years. And she describes a moment, I think it was a group of colleagues at Princeton or it was in Germany, I'm not sure which, where they were discussing, they went out for a very lovely dinner and they were discussing claustrophobia. And I get claustrophobia in elevators, I get claustrophobia in subways. And she said, I could sit there and what was your most claustrophobic moment? And she wrote, I could have said, well, when I was stuck on the cattle car, on my way to Auschwitz, she said, but I knew that would sort of stop the conversation. So I didn't say anything. It's a great memoir. It's just compelling. And I urge you all to read it. So I'm going to do something. I don't want to stop the conversation. But in terms of the plagues, I have to say that I'm left very uncomfortable with, and I love humor, I love jokes. Those who know me know that I can make a joke about anything. I'm a very irreverent person. But if this experience has brought home to me clearly, starkly, I mean, I knew it before, is my sense of privilege, not my sense of privilege, my privilege. Now they're saying Deborah Birx, who has great scarves, and gets to talk at the White House sometimes, said, go out and buy food for 2 weeks. Well, I know many of the people who are stocking the shelves in the grocery stores to which I go can't afford to buy food for their family for 1 week, much less for 2 weeks. When I go into the grocery store, I pass the mail delivery person I passed a couple of garbage men earlier. I thank them for working. And in my heart, I know they really have no choice because they couldn't pay the bills if they don't. So this has left me, when people ask me how I'm doing, lots of things have been canceled and plans and summer plans and all sorts of things. But in the global scheme of things, for me, it's hardly a plague, and I look around and see the plague other people are facing in so many different ways. And in the past couple of days, it's also become to hit home because more and more, no good friend yet, people I know well and relatives of people I know are dying. So I'm just bereft. I'm just bereft, and I weep at commercials. There was a commercial of a restaurant, an empty restaurant. I don't even know who made the commercial, so it wasn't a very good commercial if you don't remember who made it. But the tagline, it was an empty restaurant. And it said, we stay apart now so we can be together later. And I cried. Now, I don't usually cry at commercials, but I cried because I don't know when later's going to be. I don't know, I teach, of course, the universities have all closed down, but in August, September, are the students going to want to come back? Are they going to feel safe coming back? Are we going to mark Rosh Hashanah this way also? I'm just gobsmacked, as my British friends would say, by this, and by the fact that even with all the impact on my life, I'm pretty lucky. So,
Yeah, Deborah, I think you tweeted the other day that you, sort of what you were just talking about, that you found yourself saying thank you very purposefully to your mail person and your supermarket cashier, and then said to yourself, how come I don't do that all the time? And that's really echoed for me. I feel like I'm going out of my way to say thank you to people and really wondering why I don't do that all the time. And I want to circle back to you in a minute and maybe I think Noah and you.
Can I just add one thing on the finger? I was at a Seder of Jews from Rhodes Lee's Jews in Seattle many years ago. And when it came time for the 10 plagues, they laughed at the Ashkenazim. They say, oh, you Ashkenazim are so, I don't know if they said cheap, but stingy or whatever, you just do a drop. the Baal HaSeder, the person leading the Seder, takes this giant cup and there's a bowl and he pours out till the cup is empty. And then someone takes that bowl of wine, opens the door, you can't do this in an apartment, and throws it out because it's bad wine. But before he begins, he said, if there are any pregnant women at the Seder, don't watch this because it's a ayin hara, an evil eye. So for the finger dippers, this everybody pours out their whole glass.
Tema, I promise we're going to get to you, but does anybody else know of different rituals around the plagues at the Seder to perhaps share things like anybody? Okay, if you're listening and you know something like that, post it in the chat so that everyone can see, to all attendees. And that's a good reminder that if you want to make a comment about something you hear, go ahead and for everyone to see, or for the panelists, you can use the chat function. But if you have a question that you'd like me to pose to the panelists, please put it in the Q&A button, which is a different button on either the bottom or usually the left of your screen, that they will stay there longer and it's a little easier for me to get back to them. I want to go back to Tema now. Tema, your essay, one of the things you mentioned in your essay was a ritual in your family where you before pre-pandemic, everybody would talk about kind of a modern day plague. And I think this is very common in liberal Jewish households. You listed, I think, domestic violence and poverty and loneliness. And I think there are different modern Haggadot that call for people to say that. And I'm interested in you exploring for us a little bit about how you're feeling about that this year. And related to what Virginia was talking about and what Deborah was talking about and what Rabbi Raskin talked about the distinguish between things that people do and things that might be more supernatural or theological or that we can't quite understand. Because it feels like one of the points of that exercise of what's a modern day plague is really about stuff we really could fix. It's really in our control to fix or address. This pandemic does not feel that way, although we have this small role. And I don't know, how are you thinking about the spectrum of spiritual plague, God plagues, people plagues?
So I think that's actually a really interesting question, because I think even when you look at the Haggadah, if Pharaoh had said after, they turned the rods into snakes, oh my gosh, yeah, go, the rest of them wouldn't have happened, right? And of course there's midrash that it was meant to be like that God knew that it was going to take killing the firstborn, so what were the rest of the plagues? Like we know that sort of interpretation of it. But I think what we underestimate is the human role in the Passover story. So, we can look at the plague that we're dealing with now and say, wow, if China had been honest up front, if all the countries had responded accordingly, knowing that this was a novel virus and it was likely to spread, we could be looking at something very, very different right now. But the reality is the human role in it, we minimized, and now it's out of control. And so I think, even when we're talking about something like, I think I always come back, and it's, definitely my very sort of liberal Jewish way of being, but I always come back to what is the human role and what is the ethical obligation that we have in it. I mean, I have no control over domestic violence that happens elsewhere, but I can, lobby for, so I know one of the things that's been a big deal during this current pandemic is that there's very high risk of increased domestic violence. Well, so people lobbied the government to create ways for predominantly women to get out of those situations. So even if, there is human activity and things that seem like, oh, this is entirely within the realm of human control, I think that you can't take that piece out of the Passover plagues either. And so for me, it really comes down to, what can we do? What can we work towards? I see somebody just put in the chat box that it's like Dayenu. Yes, exactly, right? We sing this. If this had happened, or if God had done this, then Dayenu. But I think in this case, we could easily say, like, if all of these things had happened and humans had responded accordingly, we would be in a very different situation. I wouldn't be stuck in my apartment for the foreseeable future. And I think, when we're thinking about this, I don't get comforted by the idea that there's some divine plan that's making all of this happen. I don't find that even remotely comforting. It makes me fearful of the idea of a vengeful God and things like that. That's not where my personal theology lies. And so I come back to the idea of human role in plagues and in solving them. So I think, you know, there bad things that are not being controlled, whether they are divinely conjured or whether they are humanly acted out, there's no distinction for me at the end of the day.
So at the risk of throwing it too open or touching a third rail, I want to go, you know, Virginia made a reference to the G question. And I just find myself listening and thinking, how has this experience affected people's feelings about God, belief in God, questions about God? I was going to type in the chat to see who wanted to jump on that. Any takers? Go for it, Virginia.
Well, I'll give it a shot as a person of faith, as they say. You know, first is the simple thing, the kind of look to the helpers, Mr. Rogers thing, which is, you know, goes to Deborah's, you know, thanking and connecting with some of the people that we might have overlooked in the past, but also recognizing the, you know, we're talking about maybe livestock farming being dangerous to the earth, but getting sensitive to our very breath. You know, right now I don't go out without a mask. I don't go out at all till in New York the peak is over. But you know, walking around with a mask, far from making me more reckless, it made me extremely conscious that, you know, I might not be the best thing for other people or for the world, that I have a destructive capacity. And that inhibition, I think was in some ways very good for me. I was also thinking, you know, we think that touch is always a good thing. And you know, you hear Governor Cuomo saying, it's so sad that we can't all hug each other and touch each other, and really emphasizing that we can be apart and together at the same time. And clearly touch is a good thing. But in the cases of domestic violence, people hitting each other, Me Too cases, you know, there's something I sometimes do need to be told, don't like run and hug that person. I sometimes do it with kids too much, you know, just go pick them up when they might not want to be picked up. And, you know, just using that touch as, I mean, it's almost like the Orthodox prohibition on touching women. It's maddening, you know, and at the same time, there's something sort of deferential about it. And when I've been wearing a mask, I've been thinking, I'm not a cat burglar trying to steal something or stay in disguise. I'm a person, I'm like modestly veiled. Like, I'm not going to bother you right now. You guys have probably had the experience when you choose to walk 6 feet around someone, there's a nice, like, right now, let's just keep our distance. You know, Joe Biden's not going to be mauling anyone with a hug anytime soon. We won't even have to analyze that, because everybody knows that we can do danger with our bodies as much as good things. And so that appreciation of the social world, I mean, not to mix that up too much with faith in God, but in the absolute mystery of these pathogens, I find a little bit of just awe. Not God did this for a reason, but more like, man, what a universe that these tiny things we can't even see are making us do all these things that may be good for us. You know, we've reduced traffic that may, you know, we don't know.
Before you know it, you'll be talking about the bright side of plagues.
The bright side of plagues. Well,
you
right.
see,
So
like
we have that.
Carbon emissions are way down.
Yes.
Crime
is down. I mean, this crazy thing. I don't know what you all make of it or what public health people make of it. Cuomo says there are not enough non-COVID patients. What were all those people doing? That the hospitals have been emptied. And he said, because there's fewer auto accidents and less crime. I mean, how crazy.
Yeah, but that's also because some people, I mean, the thing I think people don't understand when they're not here is that our society is not functioning at all. I mean, in New York, we have no, you know, crime is down because people can't leave the house. Mm-hmm. And I mean, our hospital, the thing with all that hospital admissions numbers I wonder about is, you can't go to the hospital. So I wonder how much those numbers are that they're just not admitting people because the hospitals are full.
Yeah.
Well, that
and
people
they're
are
dying
being sick at home, right?
Right.
People are
And
afraid to go.
we have a lot of people. I mean, I knew someone, one of my friends died yesterday. One of my mom's friends died the day before. Another friend of ours died in his car. I mean, this is not you can't compare what's happening to here to anything ever that has ever happened to any, I mean, you could, the closest is 102 years ago. And even then it was a totally different universe. I mean, I just think we're not even getting a set. We can't, the data isn't even good because everything is so under siege.
Yeah.
Tema, I know you want to jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, I just have a hard time seeing the bright side of a thing that is disproportionately killing poor and racialized people. You know, the statistics are starting to come out. The statistics are starting to come out of places like Michigan, like Chicago, like I think Wisconsin was another statistic where highly disproportionate numbers of Black people are dying, and because they're the people who are still working on the front lines, the people who have pre-existing conditions because of all of the issues with access to healthcare, and so I have a really hard time sort of saying, wow, you can see the mountains behind Los Angeles, this is really great for us, and detaching that piece and the fact that, you know, many of us are sitting and sort of acknowledging that we're living in relative privilege. Like, I work from home anyway. My life has not changed that much other than the fact that being an immune compromised person, I can't see anyone. I'm just here. But, you know, I'm in sort of a very privileged position, but I fear for family members of mine who live in densely populated neighborhoods in New York, in affordable housing, and so what do you do when it just, I think I start to have sort of flashes. I don't know if any of you saw that somebody in France actually strongly suggested testing the vaccines before they were really ready to go to human trials in Africa, because Africa was going to have no way to control the disease anyway. And so I have a really hard time detaching, like, you know, less traffic and less crime from who's dying, who doesn't have the option to not go to work every day, and also doesn't have the option to procure and I'm talking outside of the medical field, like the people who are working in stores every day face to face with people who aren't being provided with protective equipment, never mind the shortage that people are dealing with in hospitals. So to me, they're just so deeply entrenched and you really can't separate them. And I think in my piece, when I started talking about, like, look, this is actually showing us a whole bunch of the sort of plagues that we're dealing with in society. For me, this is one of the clearest places where it comes up, is just who is not okay right now.
Yeah, so I agree with that completely. And of course, I am ultimately joking about the idea of bright sides of plagues. I do think there's this irony, which is that from whatever point you sit in, you do see these things, you know, whether it's people taking pictures of the mountains and the clear sky in Los Angeles, or I'll give you an example. I ventured out 2 days ago with my son to acquire a 3D printer because we are trying to print masks. And so we thought it was actually worth going out and, you know, curbside pickup of a 3D printer. And I have never driven out it through suburban Maryland in this little traffic ever. And I've lived here for 35 years. And so on the one hand, we're talking to each other, kind of marveling about how horrible it is. And on the other hand, we are kind of like, wow, it's kind of nice to be able to drive out Rockville Pike without ever stopping at a light, you know? And so I do think your point is exactly right. And it all is disproportionately on certain people's backs. Although I will say this is less so than certain other things. Like day-to-day life is, the distribution of benefits in day-to-day life is grossly unfair. What's notable to me about this situation is not that the distribution of pain is notably unfair, but that, you know, Boris Johnson is in the hospital too, right? You are not insulated from this no matter who you are. And there are people of extraordinary privilege who are being admittedly not at the same level of concentration, but you are, you know, Virginia's reference to the Masque of the Red Death is not wholly, you know, there's a certain quality of that here too. Yes, it is being visited disproportionately on the poor, disproportionately on people who can't, who can least afford to the healthcare. It is also being visited on, you know, the people who have who are not any of those things. And so I do think that there is this irony of it, that you can't help but notice the things in your life that are weirdly, you know, weirdly affected by it in ways that we would otherwise say is good. Low traffic, low pollution, you know, lower carbon emissions, more time with your family, you know, et cetera. And so it is not to make light of the situation, although it is to make light of the situation, but it's not to make fun of the situation that I say, you know, I cannot help noticing the bright sides.
I mean, and no, I know you want to jump in here.
With the caveat that it is immoral to do so.
But, and no, I think you were going to jump in here. There's a strong history of being able to grapple with the serious and also find either the humor or the joy kind of in parallel in our history, right? And Noah and then Deborah pick up after that.
Yeah, I mean, just to know, for instance, reading all of the articles, I saw there was a vast array of interpretations. And we're left with that. We're left with a very infinitely complex ecosystem of events. And I view history that way. I think, for instance, part of political debates is that people see an event and then they want to interpret a cause and effect. And I said, well, it's an intersection of many factors, right? Why a person blows a cafe up, right? His father beat him, he grew up poor, he was brainwashed, you know, wars from the West. And we pick one or two of them to, you know, and this event also, you can turn into 1,000 movies. It's a Mel Brooks movie, it's a Woody Allen movie. It's a tragic documentary. So of course we're left with our own creative imaginations of how to interpret God's will, which we'll never gain access to. But that's also part of our history, and part of the Torah itself, for instance, is our struggle to discover meaning in conversation with God. And ultimately the meaning which will prevail is the meanings which we most derive from it and take and move forward in constructive ways. But I was just pointing out that there is, of course, a great place for humor in Jewish history and suffering, right? There's a book on humor during the Holocaust, of jokes carved into the sides of beds and stuff. It's called Laughter in Hell. And it's not to devalue, but certainly as a mark of resilience and, of course, a psychological defense system as well. But I think Benjamin certainly has a place in the discussion of meaning and the endurance of human spirit in such difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I was not suggesting that humor is bad necessarily. And of course there's humor from the Holocaust, but it comes from the victims. And we who sit in to paraphrase very badly Primo Levi's poem, Shema, we who sit in our comfortable homes, eating our comfortable meals, warm, cool, whatever it might be, we aren't the ones, I think, to be making the jokes. That's all. And I understand, Ben, what you were trying to do, and I know you were not trying to make light, but I'm just uncomfortable, I guess, with it at this point. But I wanted to sort of shift something here, and I don't know if my fellow panelists will go with it. One of the things that this has reminded me of, and it's not by chance that it's one of the Aseret HaDibrot, one of the 10 Commandments, about lying. And never has it been clearer to me, you know, as much as there are lots of things I don't like about Andrew Cuomo, and I don't even live in New York, but I liked when the subways were getting better till he didn't like the guy who was fixing them was getting too much attention and he fired them or whatever. But just contrast one of his briefings with what you hear from the White House, other than Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. And how I painfully yearn for leadership that will speak truth and that we can believe. It's just so striking to me, the lack of leadership in our country. The Daily, your friend, what's his name, Jodi at the Daily,
Michael Barbaro.
Yeah, just did a wonderful thing on the return of the governors, and they're the ones who are showing the leadership. But to have this lack of leadership and this inability to believe what's coming out is just, to me, devastating. So it's leadership and truth, and you only get one chance. I have a sort of student who was doing a proposal for this administration. And he said, I'm going to leave out this part because even though I know it's important, I know they don't like it so much. And I said, don't. I know you're just starting and I know it's a big contract, but you only get one shot at your reputation. And if you leave out a crucial piece, when you come back another time, no one will know whether they can truly believe what you have to say or not. So the absence of true leadership is just devastating. It's just, leaving me bereft. And yet I know some good jokes about this whole thing, which I'd be happy to share at another time. So.
Thank you, Deborah. We have about 10 minutes left. I just want to pause for a sec to let everybody on the call know, to thank you again for joining us, to let you know that because you've signed up for this Zoom, we're going to give you, I think, a 3-month free subscription to the Forward, and all of our coronavirus coverage, including all of these wonderful essays, are available free in general to the public. I want to also just thank Lisa Lepson for putting this event together, along with Gabby Brooks and Dina Cooperman, and a big, huge thanks to Batya Ungar-Sargon, our opinion editor, who is the person who commissioned all of these essays and made this project actually happen. And not only that, gets us thinking every day about the hardest subjects that our community is tackling. We do seem to have a little bit of a going back and forth between the chat and the Q&A. If you have a question you want me to ask, please do put it in the Q&A. I'm gonna raise 2 and throw it open to people, and this may be the only 2 we really get to, but somebody has asked whether, picking up on what Deborah was just saying, have Andrew Cuomo, Bill de Blasio, maybe other leaders in other parts of the country that you've been watching, are they demonstrating Jewish values, would you say, whether they're Jewish or not? Through this crisis? Do you see people demonstrating Jewish values? And then somebody else has asked, and I just feel like this is what everybody wants to know, right? What would you suggest as the most important message to deliver to a multi-generational Seder? We're all kind of confronting what's the best way to get through the Seder this year and make it meaningful, given all of the restrictions and also all of the inspiration. And then I'll just give you one more to throw out there, and then we'll just have a free-for-all. But Ephraim Perlmutter asks, has anyone given any thought to the perspective of Pharaoh to the Exodus events? And I think that is something that some of the essayists really did take on. I think some of you as well. This idea of, in the Haggadah, of course, we are not the victims of the plague. And now you guys have already talked a little bit about, are we in fact the victims, the creators, the owners of this plague? We all experiencing it. So we've got 3 big things, and y'all can just have at them. Go ahead, Virginia. Start us off.
I'll give a shot at one of them. Sorry, my very from son just came in and is going to correct anything I try to say in Hebrew. I'll take a shot at that. And this is sort of to Tama's point. There is a history of course, thinking that certain populations are disproportionately infected and infectious. And this is often where Jews fall, especially in the Black Death. But the Chinese are that now, and suffering hate crimes because they're considered infectious and infected. There's another weird thing that's less noticed, and this I think goes to the so-called first responders. In 1793, it was abolitionists in Philadelphia who believed that Black people were uniquely immune to yellow fever. And so that's why they had to, and often, by the way, and this comes, there's a weird connection with Trump's obsession with this malaria drug. There was some idea that they had this thing, malaria, that was so confounding to certain white bodies that they might be somehow impervious to it and thus needed to dance attendance on the elites and risk getting the disease themselves. I love all these calls for volunteerism from my Governor Cuomo, but it is disproportionately women and people of color going out there. The way that immunity was seen in women in past plagues, including the Spanish flu, was that they were considered Lady Bountifuls. They were angels. They were nurses. They were Florence Nightingale. They couldn't get sick, so they had to go tend to people. And that is interesting because you're either immune and you're kind of a magic person, like a Black person, uniquely strong, or a woman, uniquely virtuous, or you're diseased and you have to stay distant from. I will end by saying one thing that I also think is very germane to the sort of concept of Jewish values. Scott Knowles, who's a disaster expert, was on at Drexel. He was on Trumpcast recently. Said this really interesting thing, which is we're looking for survivors. So we're talking about people sick and dying now, but as we all know, people who've had it, some of them have, it seems, their immunities. And I started to hear people, I said on Twitter that these survivors are our great asset. The people who've been through this to hell and back can take our nation to hell and back. And so we're thinking of the sick as right now as deserted, as cursed, but in fact, they will walk around and be able to help us, not just help us through it, but also help us survive it with their immunities. And, I was kind of joking with some friends who've had it, who keep saying, I can't wait to give my plasma. It's just like, you're so lucky, and they feel a little bit lucky, and I think they deserve it. So it's the survival. It's our stories and our suffering that give us strength. And I think that's part of the Jewish values.
Just to put a gloss on that, I once had a conversation with Robert J. Lifton, and I noticed that in his book on Hiroshima, which won the National Book Award in 67, 68, I think it was, he talked about survivors, and it's one of the shifts of the use of from victims to survivors. And I said, were you doing that consciously? And he said something to me, which it knocked my socks off or whatever. And he said, when you talk about a victim, you wonder, who was it? How did this person let this thing happen to them? And when you talk about a survivor, you're talking about someone who overcame. What's wrong with the person who did this to them? And when you talk about a survivor, it's someone who overcame that. I just botched what he said to me, but you get the difference. And I love it that now we're talking about victims, but God willing, and we already can begin to talk about some survivors.
Deborah, people were asking the name of Ruth Graber's memoir. Is that Haven? Is that
I think it's To Live Again, Virginia. Isn't that it? Still Alive.
Okay, I'll find the link and put it in the chat. I'm gonna, we have about 5 minutes left. I'm gonna, just because we have so many wonderful speakers here, I'm gonna just ask everyone to kind of go around and share whatever's on their mind, closing thoughts. We'll start with you, Molly, then Ben, then Noah, then Virginia, Tema, and return to Deborah at the end, okay?
Okay.
Say whatever's on your mind, really. Pick up on anything or throw out a new question, as you wish.
I'm happy to be here. I hope we can have Passover next year in person.
Do you think, Molly, that there would be anything, like, I really wonder how things are going to change. Like, this Seder is going to be so different. We're going to Zoom. We're going to be in these small groups. Do you imagine that next Passover, there'll be kind of a feeling that there's something that we'll still have from this experience at that Seder?
Living through this is going to change us all. There's no comparable experience. So I think that it would be I can't imagine that it's not going to change. I mean, those of us who are in New York are experiencing something that is, I mean, I know Virginia's in Brooklyn. You can't leave we can't leave our houses.
Right.
You know, I mean, we can't even go outside. You go outside, it's like, so I don't think that people will be normal after this. Like, I think it's like Great Depression. I think it will shape the culture and the society in ways we can't even begin to quantify.
So Gabriel Lowe put out just on the chat just now, I'm going to start, several people have been saying this to me lately, to tomorrow, Wednesday night, we should say, instead of next year in Jerusalem, we can say next year in person. And I want to, while we're not in person, remind everybody we have 2 more events already scheduled on the calendar that we'd love you to come back for. On April 14th, we're going to be doing a panel called Look to the Helpers. We're going to be talking to some of the people who are in the mix right now, first responders, people feeding the hungry in our community. So that's on April 14th. And then on April 21st, Batya is going to host 2 of our opinion columnists in a debate on is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. So there's a lot of great panelists coming up. You'll get an email tomorrow with some more information from this event and invitations to the others. And now we'll go back to our closing round. I think I said Ben was next, or Noah, I can't remember.
Ben.
I don't have anything wise or deep to close with, so I'll settle for something, for 2 trivial and unimportant things. The first is that I do think societies are extremely resilient, and everything we're going through is a creature of one of 2 things. It's the lack of a effective short-term treatment for this condition, and the second is the more profound is the lack of a inoculation for it. Both of those are redressable, and so while I agree with Molly that this will have a long tail, I don't think it is a apocalyptic scenario that is going to end civilization as we know it, and we will bounce back from it. And the second thing is that, we will, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have spent more time socializing in novel ways in the last 4 weeks than I have done in the rest of my life combined. And I actually think that's pretty neat. And so while I look forward to next year in person, I also hope we will not stop meeting like this.
Very nice.
I like it, Ben.
Virginia, you've got the yellow box, Virginia, so go ahead, and then Noah.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I'll say something that is, a tragedy worth observing, and then move to the comedy and the usual leave them laughing. The tendency of people in plague years, and I only, this is not my area of expertise, although I did work on plague literature a little bit in graduate school. And those accounts, it's inevitable that you weigh in on the leadership in plague years. An extraordinarily interesting thing happened with the Justinian plague, where this great chronicle of it is Procopius, and he was he wrote about all the bodies in the streets. The management of the bodies, which we're seeing in Brooklyn, is a huge part of plague years. People's memory of just dignity being violated because bodies are heaped up, as they invariably are, and that's something for us to reflect on. But his accounts of the bodies, his accounts of how everybody was sick, it sounded like Black Plague ruminations. And then he went to, after Justinian died, he wrote this pornographic satire about how it was all Justinian's fault, right? Sounds like what we'll probably do with Trump, what I would do with Trump. Well, last year in 2019, a group of scientists dug up fungal spores and all kinds of other things from Constantinople and other kinds of Roman monuments and numismatics, and determined that this plague was not that bad. They called it something like an irrelevant plague. So the way history will look at leadership and the not responsible at all for the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. So the way history will see this, we don't know yet. And the short-term politics, we also don't know yet. But the tragedy I do think we should recognize is that, you know, it took this long to make it so starkly clear we had to get to a body count before we could see the catastrophe represented by the leadership in America. And, you know, I really hoped we would get through this year without the kind of body count we saw under George W. Bush. And it looks like we very well may not. You know, the number of dead in New York is now more than the number of dead, you know, number of people who died in 9/11. Fortunately, because it's a microbe, we won't respond with a war, but with an election. Then on the comedy side, and it's gallows humor, but Noah, I'm so glad you chose the form of cartoon and not of something else. And here's why. You know that you all probably can know the French form danse macabre. It's a plague form with dancing skeletons, like you can see it in the Grateful Dead iconography, you know, and the skeletons, the dead characters, are dragging the rich to their graves, digging graves for the rich, because the satire that comes out of plague years is what Ben was referring to with Boris Johnson, that even the hi-hats get it. Even the, you know, and it's leveling in the extreme. In years when we've been thinking about class so much, to think about ourselves as lungs, bodies, microbes is so humbling and potentially humiliating, and ripe for satire, for the right imagination. So I've been looking at a lot of danse macabre, and man, that stuff is weird. If you like Day of the Dead and Carnival and Mardi Gras, it's interesting stuff. I don't know how you are with skeletons, but I'd love to see you try your hand at it.
Yeah, I'm not so. I don't have many cartoons about skeletons. I think my love of cartoons goes back to Gary Larson, actually. I was a big fan of The Far Side. I just wanted to share a brief closing statement. This connected to this conversation of, you know, are we responding with Jewish values? And I thought, well, what is it? What are these Jewish values? And I think for me, the ultimate Jewish value or story, of course shared by other cultures and civilizations as well, is that history it isn't random, that history has a destiny, and that there is a very, very difficult to see, but there is a guiding light of goodness, so to say. So that doesn't mean, of course, during these times that we say Gamzu Latova, everything's for the good, we celebrate and sing and dance. Obviously, in Jewish law, you don't walk into a shiva and say, it's a good thing and they die. Let me tell you why. Right? It's considered an avera, so to say, or sin. But that we look forward with hope and faith, and that's the place of faith, which sometimes is the place of silence. Is that, you know, we see that history, of course, you know, you say, well, the Holocaust was just 100 years ago. How can you say history progresses? But perhaps in the bigger picture, we hope that we're going towards a brighter end. And you know, my wife's catching some of these videos here and there of people jumping up to a podium and saying, let me tell you why it happens. And I did one of these cartoons called the, I forget whose article it was for, the Why Corona contest. Everyone wants to jump at the podium. And I said, honey, they're salesmen. That's how they make a living. They get up in videos and give answers to. So steer away from anyone who seems to have a definitive answer of what's happening here, but certainly be in a place of faith. And then the last is briefly is that there's this famous medrash of Moses talking with God, and God shows him the suffering of a very famous student, Rabbi Akiva. Without going into details, the Romans torture him, and God says, how can you do such a thing, God? And God says, shut your mouth, none of your business, it's my world. And of course, it seems like a cold answer, but ironically, within that medrash, Moses is talking to God. So of course, there is this God, during these times, and he's in conversation with him. And hopefully in a place of faith, maybe a place of silence at times, we remain in our own minds or imaginations in conversation with God in a place of hope.
Well,
yeah, so I mean, I keep coming back to the idea that when this is over, and God willing, it'll be soon, that the things that have led to where we are today aren't going to go away, even with an election. We might have better leadership, but all the systemic issues are still going to be there. So, I think back, from where I sit in Canada, I think back to the H1N1 pandemic, or epidemic, pandemic. I can't remember what the right word for which class of virus these things are, when Health Canada sent body bags to Indigenous communities. Well, thank God no one's sending body bags this time, but there's huge fear about what happens because the infrastructure hasn't improved since 2009. And so we're going to be facing all of these same systemic issues, and some of them are likely to be exacerbated by the hit that the economy is taking. So, in my essay for the collection, I came back to the idea that after the Israelites are freed, they wander the desert for 40 years before they're allowed into the promised land. And what does that wandering look like after this? Things are going to change. And I think, and I come, whether you want to call it a social justice lens or whatever, that we are all going to be in a position to, yes, go out and vote. And I am an American citizen and I'm requesting my ballot somehow through all of this. But, I think going out and voting is so important, but also paying attention to the systemic issues that aren't necessarily fixed by voting. And I saw somebody put into the chat box just now, the trust in science has been really, really, really frayed to the point that there are obviously people saying, oh, I'm fine, I'm immune, and going out and doing whatever. I mean, they just instituted large fines here in Toronto for people who refuse to socially distance because people are all going to the beach and the park and everything else. And that's not going to change. And so hopefully we have to figure out, I think, as a society, how do we address that in a way that actually moves the needle on these issues? Because my guess is this is not the last novel virus that is going to appear. And so we need to be more ready for the next one.
Earlier this year, actually in the fall, I wrote 2 pieces for the forward on the subject of gratitude. One was to Colonel Vidman, who spoke before the Congress and how grateful he was for what this country had given him. Of course, then he was fired. And then gratitude to Tiffany Haddish for reminding us of the joys in Judaism. And it's a hakarat hatov, recognition of the good. The first thing we say is that Jews say traditionally in the morning is modani, thank you. I hope when this is over, we continue to show. Tema reminds me, as a Canadian, she always says thank you. I say it, but not all the time. And that we're grateful for what we have, and grateful for what we have with enough awareness to share it with others. So that's my hope.
Thank you, Deborah. What a great way to close. And I know we're over time and people have their next Zoom, whatever it is, waiting. Thank you to all of our panelists, terrific, smart, wonderful women, and a couple guys who left us early. And thank you for joining us, all of you participants. Thank you for reading the forward, for supporting independent journalism, particularly at this kind of time. And thank you for helping us to build community in this time of social distancing. Chag Sameach. And may all your Zooms
and
not be bombed.
Brava.
Thanks, Jodi. Bye.
Bye-bye.